to account for the overlap of all the various developmental disorders that we are dealing with when we're talking about autism. Autism is not, as you know, one disorder. It's a collection of autisms, but also autism overlaps with a lot of other developmental problems, and it's rare, if at all possible, to find a case of pure autism in the world. So I coined the phrase ESSENCE, early symptomatic syndromes eliciting neurodevelopmental clinical examinations. And the point of this is that in early life, if we want to make a diagnosis as precise as possible and to intervene as precisely as possible, we would need to take the full developmental problems of all affected individuals into account. And these are children who present somewhere before the age of 5, usually, at a speech and language therapists or a psychiatrists or a pediatricians or a GPs or a child health center professional, and they all see that there's a problem, but they differ on how to diagnose the problem. So let's see here, how do I go forward here? A number of different syndromes present very early in life, actually usually well before 5 years of age, somewhere in the Western world at some specialist center with either an autism spectrum disorder or a disruptive behavior disorder such as ADHD or Tourette syndrome or bipolar disorder or so-called specific language impairment, which I would want you to consider may not exist at all. There are very few cases of specific language impairment. The specificity of the language impairment is in doubt because the vast majority of children diagnosed with specific language impairment also have other problems such as ADHD or developmental disabilities of other kinds. Learning disability or so-called mental retardation, developmental coordination disorders, behavioral phenotype syndromes, genetic disorders that have a peculiar or particular behavioral presentation, and even some of the epilepsy syndromes such as Landau-Kleffner syndrome and continuous spike wave activity during slow sleep, very often, if not always, present with some behavioral or developmental problems before the onset of the overt seizure disorder. So one of these syndromes could be diagnosed in a child presenting with this sort of type of problem. It could be a problem regarding general development, and it's likely that a pediatrician or a general practitioner would see such a child, or it could be a motor control problem or perceptual sensory problem, and it would be an OT or a pediatrician or a GP that would see that child, or a communication and language problem or language problem, and it might be a speech and language therapist. In our country, in Sweden, the vast majority of children presenting with a language delay are seen only by speech and language therapists, and they're diagnosed with speech and language impairment, and they're kept with a speech and language therapist for years, and then they enter school, and then somebody says, wow, this is a child with autism, or this is a child with learning disability. Why hasn't anybody told this family that it's not just speech and language impairment? Or activity impulsivity. Okay, I'm sorry. Activity and impulsivity problems would lead to a consultation perhaps with a child and adolescent mental health service or a pediatrician. Attentional problems, similar. Social interaction and reciprocity problems also might be seen by child psychiatrists, or nowadays, more and more often, in specialized autism centers. And the specialized autism centers are actually a problem. They are... Okay. So I'll just show a few slides then, and talk very slowly. The autism centers that we are currently experiencing growing up all over the world are very often so focused on autism that they miss out on all the other problems that children with autism actually usually have. So even though I have been one of the people in the world who really advocated for autism centers for a long, long time, I'm slowly beginning to see the backside of this, in that people who work in the autism centers, if not properly trained in the whole ESSENCE sort of way of thinking about developmental disorders, might miss out on very important things like attention deficits in children with Asperger's syndrome, speech and language problems that may be real speech and language problems in children with autism, etc. Tourette syndrome is usually missed out on, depression, and a lot of other things in specialized autism centers. I'm not saying that autism centers could not be very good, but the current development, at least in our country, is for them to become over-specialized on just autism. You can see on this list that even things like early feeding problems are very often the first signal that there is one of these essence disorders. And the presenting symptom in any one child, be it autism, be it ADHD, be it language impairment, might be one of these symptoms, or several of them, or all of them. And it's very difficult to say at the primary stage which one or which of these conditions will eventually be diagnosable. So I'll give you two examples of how things can turn out if we just look at where the child shows up with a symptom. We have looked at children presenting in well baby clinics with language impairment at 2.5. We looked at all the children presenting in one area of a suburb of Gothenburg. So it's a total population study looking at over 1,000 children, and 6% of those 2.5-year-olds had some degree of language impairment as judged by screening at 2.5. They had fewer than 50 communicative words, or major comprehension difficulties, or even major disarticulation problems. And they were also seen by speech and language therapists who diagnosed according to language tests that there was indeed a language impairment, not just that there was a symptom of language impairment, but testing showed that they had severe language impairment. Now, they were followed up when they were 4, 6, and 7.5 years of age by people blind to the original assessment with a control group of children who didn't have the diagnosed language impairment. They all had persistent language problems at 4, 6, and 7.5. The majority had dyslexia at 7.5, and 70% had either autism, Asperger's syndrome, ADHD, learning disability, or an IQ in between 70 and 80 at 7.5 years of age. So a full 70% of children presenting with language impairment in the general population turn out to have an essence diagnosable problem, such as autism, ADHD, or learning disability. And again, I would like to stress, this is in the general population. So saying that a child with language impairment is likely at 2.5 to grow out of the problem is not likely to be true. More than half, and indeed 70% at least, have a major neuropsychiatric neurodevelopmental disorder 5 years down the line. If we instead look at children referred with a suspicion of autism or a social communication disorder, we did the first such study in the world in the 1980s when we looked at 28 children. At the time, it was a big group of children under the age of 3 presenting with suspicion of autism. 75% of those children met criteria for autism spectrum disorders several years down the line, and all the others, all the 7 other children, met criteria for another essence disorder, ADHD or mental retardation, language delay. Now, just recently we published a much bigger study on similarly aged children presenting with a suspicion of autism at 2.5 to 3. 208 children in Stockholm, and when followed up, they met criteria for an autism spectrum disorder in 90% of the cases. And the remaining 10% met criteria for another developmental disorder. So it's very, very, very unlikely, if at all likely to happen, that somebody presenting with a clinical strong suspicion of autism before the age of about 3 is not going to have a major developmental disorder several years down the line. So it's very unlikely that you're going to make a false positive scare, as it were. They may not all have classic autism once they're followed up. In fact, only about half of them will still have classic autism when you look at them several years down the line. But all the others will have either another autism spectrum disorder, such as Asperger's syndrome, or another developmental essence disorder. So if we're looking at what are the first symptoms that we have in the literature or in clinical practice in terms of autism, what do we know about the presenting symptoms in terms of autism? Motor control problems are the only problems that have been consistently reported in the first year of life in children with autism. That is, children later presenting with a diagnosis of autism or Asperger's syndrome. They have a Möbius-like face. They look as though their facial nerves are not, that their facial muscles are not innervated. They have very strange movements from back to front and so-called compartmentalized motor development. Perceptual abnormalities, including auditory perceptual abnormalities, are very typical of young children with autism, including things like not responding to their own name. Language problems usually, of course, are not diagnosable until into the second and sometimes even third year of life. Behavior problems are present, if you ask carefully, in almost everybody with autism in the first few years of life. And there's very little initiation, if any, of joint attention. On the other hand, children with autism cannot be separated out from other children in terms of not being able to respond to joint attention attempts by other people. Other people may well be able to initiate a joint attention episode, as it were, with somebody with autism, but the child with autism does not initiate the joint attention. This is probably typical of autism. Hyperactivity and impulsivity are usually extreme when they're present in autism, and any child presenting with huge ADHD-type symptoms in the first few years of life should be suspected first and foremost of having autism rather than having just ADHD. Or another essence disorder such as epilepsy or a strong degree of learning disability. Hypoactivity, on the other hand, is also present in a proportion of cases, and sleep problems very often in this group. Delayed general development and mood swings are also common first symptoms in autism, and one or several of these could be the presenting symptoms in autism. Now, what about ADHD? Well, if you look at the list that's in the literature, you'll find it's exactly the same list of symptoms, except the self-initiated joint attention, which isn't on the list of typical symptoms of ADHD in the first few years of life. So just judging by early symptoms, you wouldn't be able to say, well, that's very likely autism rather than ADHD, except maybe extremes of hyperactivity, which, of course, most people would think that's ADHD. Well, it's usually not ADHD if it presents in the first few years of life with extremes of hyperactivity. So how many children are affected by essence problems? At least 10% of children under 18 are at that time being affected by any type of psychiatric major disorder in this group, including ADHD, autism spectrum, Tourette's syndrome, conduct disorder, and bipolar disorder. And another 10% of all young people are affected by various kinds of psychosocial problems. And some of those may be triggered or interacting with essence. About 5%, usually included in these two other groups, are children with dyslexia. And the vast majority of children with dyslexia have language problems early in life. And as you can see and understand from what I've already said, there's a huge degree of overlap between the various diagnostic categories here. It's not easy to say, this is just autism, this is just ADHD. You'll have to wait and see over time whether more symptoms emerge of other developmental problems. Anyway, when looking back at people who have presented before 18 years of age with a major neurodevelopmental or neuropsychiatric problem, the vast majority, more than 90%, have had major symptoms before 5 years of age. So, how common? We've already heard that it's a common problem. And ASD, autism spectrum disorders, are at least 1% of the general population. The new studies suggest it's probably even more common than that. But also, if you think about it, one person with an autism spectrum disorder has about 6 or 7 very close people who are related to this person. So at least 6 to 10% of the general population of people are affected in their daily lives by autism. If you have a member in your family or in your extended family with autism, you're hit by autism, as it were. And so many people are affected by autism in that sense. It's not even just 1%, but more like 5 to 10% of the general population. Half of all children with autism are currently, at least in Sweden, recognized before the age of 5 to 6 years, and the main presenting symptoms we've already spoken about. Now, here's a list of the coexisting disorders that you will find in autism in any population study of autism. Epilepsy, about 20%, and there's a very poor outcome if the epilepsy is left untreated. Other medical disorders are present in another 20%, intellectual disability in 15 to 20%, ADHD in 31 to 50%, tic disorders 40%, and interestingly, young children who have tics and autism have a better outcome altogether than children who don't have tics in this group. OCD is present in 10%, depression in 20%, bipolar disorder in 15%, catatonia in 15%, usually emerging around the time of adolescence, anxiety in 25%, no coexisting disorder, 0%, and sleep disorders in 50%. I'd like to also make the point that most of the current evidence suggests that autism in itself predicts autism in the long run, but it doesn't necessarily predict a terrible outcome. It's all the associated problems that are much more predictive of poor outcome. Things like epilepsy, learning disability, and speech and language problems. They tend to predict the really poor outcome in autism. Autism predicts autism, but not necessarily a terrible outcome. What is autism? Autism is a multifactorially determined group of conditions, and there are almost as many different causes as there are cases. So, hence the term autisms. Synapse and clock genes probably play a major role and often affect synapse formation and function, but environmental factors contribute to the clinical presentation, perhaps even in most cases, and can themselves cause autism in some instances. We believe that the prefrontal temporal brainstem and cerebellar regions of the central nervous system are usually affected. These areas constitute a functional network, the so-called default network, which appears to be critically differentially functioning in autism. Now, ADHD, as an example of essence, occurs in about 5% of all school-age children, and so with the same line of reasoning as in autism, you would expect about 25% of the general population to be affected by ADHD. They have ADHD in their families. This is similar across the globe, and it's not typical of Sweden or France or anywhere else. What is ADHD? Well, it's a largely genetic, similar phenotype problem resulting also from various types of environmentally caused brain dysfunction, for instance, in connection with prematurity. And autism and ADHD are both similar in terms of not exactly where in the brain it is and which functions in the brain are hit, but the underlying problems are genetic and environmentally triggered. In ADHD, I already mentioned that there are 0% no comorbidity cases in autism, and there are about 15% of all ADHD cases in the general population who don't have another condition. 85% at the very least have another condition. Boys are overrepresented in the clinical world, girls are clearly missed, and girls probably have a slightly different phenotype. We've published several papers and big studies to suggest that there are some minor differences between boys and girls when it comes to autism presentation and when it comes to ADHD presentation. And girls are clearly missed throughout the world, and it's not likely that the real ratio between boys and girls is 3 to 1, more likely 1.5 to 1 in both autism and ADHD. Estrogen probably has a protective effect throughout the fertile period in women, and so when women get to menopause, their ADHD and autism spectrum problems come back, if they were better in the fertile years. I've not had time to go into this, but we could have this presented on the website if people would like that. I'd just like to mention one word about the behavioral phenotype syndromes, because they're so common. All these behavioral phenotype syndromes, one at a time, are very rare. They're usually about 1 in 10,000, or 1 in 3,000, or 1 in 20,000, but together they're about 1% of the general population. And that means that we need to be looked, because they usually present with autism, ADHD, or another essence problem, which means that we have to look for them in all those presentations. So, what are the implications to conclude? Autism spectrum disorders is always a signal that other problems must be screened for. ADHD, for instance, in autism spectrum disorders is usually responsive to treatment, both pharmacological and computerized training programs. Epilepsy must be treated as a top priority. Bipolar disorder should be treated with motor stabilizers. Catatonia may need very intensive specialist interventions. DCD, developmental coordination disorder, can be responsive to focused motor training. OCD is rarely responsive to SRIs. All tricyclics probably better. Sleep disorders are usually responsive to melatonin. Violent behaviors and self-injury can be responsive to low-dose atypical neuroleptics, but psychoeducation and behavior therapy first and foremost. Severe cases should always be recognized before 5, and the majority under 3 years of age. Asperger's syndrome still will not be recognized, usually until school age. Severe hyperactivity and ADHD often may be presenting symptoms. And ADHD is also, the same holds if you see a child with ADHD, you need to screen for all these things. So finally, ASD, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, bipolar disorder, learning disability, speech and language impairment, developmental coordination disorder, they overlap to a very marked degree throughout life and are often not clearly separable under 5. All children presenting with major impairing essence symptoms need to be followed up. That is, any child presenting with any of these symptoms before age 5 years need to be looked at again and again, not just once. It's never okay to say, he'll grow out of it, she'll grow out of it. It's most unlikely that that's ever going to happen. Thank you very much.